would like to open up by saying how much we are honored and delighted to have you join us in conversation with Professor Roberts as she celebrates the 20th anniversary of her groundbreaking book, Killing the Black Body, Race, Reproduction, Race, Reproduction, I don't know why I'm nervous for some reason, Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty. I want to thank our sponsors as well for helping us to pull off this event, the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Council, the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality, the Barnard Center for Research on Women, the Institute for Research in African American Studies, the Center for Gender, Sexuality, and Law, the Columbia Law School, the board members of the Collaborative to Address Equity Through Research at Columbia University, including Vina Tran, Anna Hidalgo, Yolanda Celie Ruiz, and Kaima Glover. I'm sure all of us are entering into this room in the conversation on reproductive justice and racial equality from different vantage points. And when this book first came out in 1997, I was in graduate school, and I entered the conversation on the sterilization of poor women of color with great naivete. In fact, I was a bit skeptical about this happening back then. And perhaps this was part due to the fact that it was my first women's studies class, and perhaps it might be due to the fact that I was raised very conservative with a religious upbringing. However, when I was in the hospital in the early 2000s for a blood clot, a medical resident who thought I was Latina, didn't speak English, and had no insurance, yelled at me to sign the papers for them to take out my reproductive capabilities. Amazingly enough, as I was laying there, I thought about those readings on reproductive justice, and I was like, this is true. This is happening to me. And so I thought about, however, not just myself, but the many women of color who are facing structural constraints around reproductive justice and racial inequality. So today, 20 years later, I'm entering this conversation with Professor Roberts with a grateful heart for her systematic work on the assault of Black women's bodies, which continues to remain critical at this historical juncture in America. As many of you may be aware, Dorothy Roberts is the George A. Weiss University Professor of Law and Sociology, the Raymond Pace and Sadie Tanner Mossell Alexander Professor of Civil Rights, and Professor of Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. I said to her while we were speaking, you must be very busy. Her groundbreaking scholarship in law and public policy focuses on issues in health, social justice, and bioethics. In addition to the book we are celebrating today, her other major books include Fatal Invention, How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century, and Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare. She has also written over 100 articles and book chapters, and over the years, her work has been supported by organizations such as the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Science Foundation, and Stanford Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity. I ask you now to join me in warmly welcoming Professor Roberts as she reflects on the 20th anniversary of her book.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks to all the co-sponsors for this event. It feels really great to be in this room. Thank you so much, Alonda, for inviting me and organizing all of this, and Vina Tran for all your help in making this come to fruition. Well, I'm really honored to be able to give some reflections on the 20th anniversary of Killing the Black Body. I write in the new preface for the 20th anniversary edition that thinking about the last 20 years since I published the book has filled me with exasperation and expectation. Exasperation because every single policy I wrote about in the book continues today. In fact, many of them have been expanded to reach even more women and intensified to become even more punitive. But also expectation and excitement because the reproductive justice movement was only beginning when Killing the Black Body was published. Most people didn't even know that term at that point. And today, there is a growing, powerful movement for reproductive justice that is reshaping the way that many activists and students and professors and policymakers are thinking about the meaning of reproductive freedom. And I want to talk about a little bit about why I wrote Killing the Black Body and about this mixture of exasperation and expectation. I began writing Killing the Black Body in 1988 when I first started teaching. That was the year I began as a professor at Rutgers University Law School in Newark. And I left legal practice because of my concern about violations of Black women's reproductive freedom. Some of you may recall, at the time, there was the so-called crack epidemic hitting inner cities around the country that was met by an intense law enforcement response, and this law enforcement response extended to making drug use during pregnancy a crime. There was some writing about it by feminists looking at the maternal-fetal conflict, but very little mention, if any at all, about how racism had created this crime of fetal abuse. And I suspected, as I read about these prosecutions, and especially about the very brutal, dehumanizing treatment of pregnant women and new mothers, I suspected that they were probably Black women and that these prosecutions were being fueled by the myths about crack babies, so-called crack babies who were supposed to become total monsters, flood the elementary schools with children destined to become criminals and welfare dependents and completely unintelligent. In fact, the statements about them said that they were lacking in social consciousness, which mirrored what was said about Black women who smoked crack during pregnancy, that they were lacking in maternal instinct. And so I suspected that these prosecutions could only happen because they were targeted at Black women. And as I began to investigate, I discovered that, yes, in fact, as far as I could determine, about 80% of the prosecutions were of Black women who were charged with some newfangled interpretation of criminal law, like assault with a deadly weapon, distribution of drugs to a minor, child neglect, attempted murder, in order to punish them. And to me, what they were being punished for didn't have anything to do with protecting their fetuses or children. It had to do with punishing them for having babies. And so I wrote a law review article arguing that that is exactly what these prosecutions constituted, the punishment of Black women for having babies. And I began to think about all the ways in which Black women, historically and at the present time, were punished for their childbearing decisions. I can remember very distinctly driving in Newark and pulling my car over and taking out a yellow legal pad, which I still was using at the time, having just graduated from the legal profession, and writing down all the welfare policy and prison policy and high-tech reproduction and these prosecutions, and then the attempted control of enslaved women's reproduction, and it just boggling my mind how extensive this history was and how the legacy continued to shape the very meaning of reproductive freedom in the United States. Now, at the time, reproductive freedom was thought of as a white woman's issue. In fact, in the introduction to Killing the Black Body, I mentioned talking about this topic at a church, a meeting at a church in Montclair, New Jersey, and a Black man standing up and saying, "Why are you talking about this? This has nothing to do with voting rights. It has nothing to do with employment discrimination, nothing to do with criminalization of Black people. That reproductive rights is a white woman's issue. And besides, it's all about abortion, and abortion is killing off Black babies. So why you're on the wrong road." And then among the major reproductive rights organizations led by white women, there was very little attention to racism and the way racism affected reproductive rights thinking and violations in the United States. In fact, there was an aversion to thinking about it because of the history of Planned Parenthood. White feminists were reluctant to really grapple with the relationship between the roots of the birth control movement and eugenics. And also, they weren't quite sure how to deal with policies that punished women for having children as opposed to punishing or preventing the decision to terminate a pregnancy. And so I found that the types of violations I wanted to write about were basically being ignored by the mainstream reproductive rights movement. And so I set about to write a history and a intersectional analysis of how racism and sexism work together historically from the very roots of the nation to create an extremely anemic meaning of reproductive freedom. In fact, one that allowed for a great deal of brutality and violence against Black women. So I began looking at the roots of this US version of reproductive freedom in the enslavement of Black women, and the way in which controlling Black women's reproductive labor was profitable for white slaveholders. So the control of Black women's bodies was essential to the very functioning of the nation, economically, but also ideologically. The idea that Black women reproduced children who were, even before their birth, destined to become enslaved, put on Black women's wombs the creation of racial oppression. I think it was the beginning of blaming Black women's wombs for the disadvantaged status of their children. So Black women's childbearing became a site for reproductive violence, but also a site for reproducing race itself. I wish I had time to talk more about that, but that idea, I continue to see ways in which it reverberates today in ways I hadn't thought about before, including when I wrote Killing the Black Body. You mentioned sterilization abuse. That was one of the ways in which Black women have been violently, their reproduction has been violently controlled, and a way in which the eugenics movement and the birth control movement intersected at the turn of the 20th century. And so there's always been this two-sided aspect of birth control in the United States, both as a means of liberation for women, liberating them from the burden of constant childbearing, but also it's always at the very same moment been a means of controlling populations and devaluing the childbearing of populations seen as inferior and as biological threats to the nation. And of course, this thinking, in fact, even the very operation of eugenics boards continued into the 1970s in some states, either officially, as in North Carolina, or unofficially in hospitals. where doctors pressured Black and Latino women to sign consent forms for sterilization or just perform the operation without even the knowledge of women. And this is hundreds of thousands of women sterilized under government-funded programs. I also wrote about how myths about Black mothers powerfully fueled these policies and institutions, and continue to do so today. So the myth of the Black Jezebel, the Black woman who's supposed to be innately promiscuous and therefore could not be raped, also providing excuse for white slaveholders who sexually assaulted their enslaved women and then enslaved the children born to those women because of the definition of race that was crafted in the 1600s in the Americas to make children follow the status of their mothers and not their fathers. The Black mammy who was acceptable because she was asexual and cared more for white children than her own children. And then the Black welfare queen who was supposed to have babies just to receive a welfare check and then spend all the money on herself. A powerful image to fuel the very eradication of the entitlement to welfare in the United States. And the continuation of eugenicist-like thinking that the reason for racial inequality, economic inequality, other forms of social inequality in this country is because the very victims of structural inequality are themselves the causes of their disadvantaged status. And therefore, you can solve social problems by keeping the women in these groups from having children. And this is a way of thinking about Black women that continued and was very prevalent at the time I was writing Killing the Black Body. Also circulating at the time were proposals for abolishing the entitlement to welfare, which passed in 1996, the year before Killing the Black Body was published. I wrote about that, but also I was writing about welfare restructuring as these arguments were taking place in Congress and also similar policies in state legislatures. And a lesser known law passed the following year, the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which mandates that states petition for termination of parental rights after a very limited time frame once children are placed in foster care. And these two laws were both promoted by devaluing Black women's childbearing. The first, the Black welfare queen image, the argument that welfare was supporting women who didn't really care about their children and only had them to get a welfare check. And then with the Adoption and Safe Families Act, the argument that Black children were languishing in foster care, that they were nobody's children, to cite the title of one book about it, and that they would be better off being adopted than being returned to their mothers. In fact, there was the language of freeing Black children from their mothers in order to let them be adopted. And in some circles, it was explicitly stated, adopted by white middle-class families who could raise them better than their Black mothers. And this marked the first time in US history that states were mandated to terminate the rights of neglectful parents, but not mandated to provide any economic support for struggling families. And so the two together meant that the United States had come to a point of saying that the way to handle the needs of struggling families was to put children, remove children from their communities and put them in more privileged families. At the same time, the fertility industry was expanding into a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it was primarily used by and created for white heterosexual couples at the time. And the images like these promoting the use of reproduction assisting technologies were always of white people. And wherever there was a story about a Black child born as a result of high-tech reproductive assistance, it was always a horror story. It was the child born by mistake, where a white woman was mistakenly given a Black man's sperm, and she gave birth to this horror of a biracial child who was going to suffer from being so different from her mother, even though the mother was biologically related to the baby. But the images were of a horrible mistake that happens when a Black child is born instead of a more valuable white child. Now, 20 years later, it's become much clearer that the policies to prevent access to abortion and family planning work together with policies to punish pregnant women. When I wrote Killing the Black Body, as I mentioned, mainstream reproductive rights organizations were afraid of that connection. They weren't sure what to do with it. It wasn't so clear as it is today that it's a unified strategy to control women's reproductive decisions and lives. Both of these rely on images of a more precious fetus who's more valuable than the life of the mother. And the punishment of Black women pretends that this has anything to do with protecting fetuses. But if we center the punishment of Black women, it becomes very clear that this is about controlling women. It has nothing to do with protecting children. States have now passed fetal protection laws, so they no longer have to use newfangled, strange, distorted interpretations of criminal law. They've got putting laws on the books that make it a crime for women to put a fetus at risk. And they're expanding to prosecuting not just women who use drugs during pregnancy, but women who are blamed for stillbirths for a number of reasons, including attempts at abortion. But there's no need in these cases for judges to find actual connection between the stillbirth and the conduct of the woman. It's just about punishing women, especially if they don't fit the standard of a deserving mother. And sterilizations of women continue in many ways. We're not even sure how many are going on in the United States today. But one investigative report found that in the state of California, incarcerated women were being sterilized at least without legal approval that was required. But I would argue they were being unethically sterilized, coercively sterilized, because they were incarcerated women at the time, and many have reported that they weren't even aware that they were being sterilized until later. The health of pregnant women has gotten worse in the United States, especially for Black women, since I wrote Killing the Black Body. Now the US stands out as the only developed country where the maternal mortality rate is increasing. And Black women are 4 times more likely than white women to die from pregnancy-related causes. In some parts of the United States, like the Mississippi Delta, Black women die from pregnancy-related causes at rates higher than in Rwanda and Kenya. It's an abomination what is going on in the US in terms of the health of pregnant women. And Black women have become even more central to the debate over abortion because Black women have the highest rate of abortion in the United States, and it's disproportionately high compared to their percentage in the population. Anti-abortion advocates have seized on this to argue that, as I heard back in when I was writing Killing the Black Body, that abortion is a form of genocide and blaming Black women who seek abortion for inflicting this harm on their own communities. One of the most egregious aspects of this are a set of billboards that went up around the country with messages like this one, which was put up here in New York City: the most dangerous place for an African American is in the womb. Repeating the message that Black women's wombs are dangerous to their children and are the cause of social problems, except here used to restrict Black women's access to abortion, whereas this message, which you could have heard during the eugenics era, was used to restrict, to coerce Black women's sterilization. In the last decade, I've become more and more interested in the ways in which punitive systems intersect in the United States with Black women at the center. Black women are disproportionately involved, Black mothers in particular, disproportionately involved in the welfare, prison, and child welfare systems. And all of these systems feed off of the same stereotypes about Black women producing criminals and welfare dependents and antisocial children, and that therefore Black mothers need to be contained and supervised and even punished in multiple ways, including keeping them from having children or separating them from their children. One thing that welfare restructuring, the law, allowed was for states to put what's called family caps or child exclusion policies into place. These are laws that were being debated when I wrote Killing the Black Body, and I have a chapter about them. But at the time, they violated federal law because there was an entitlement to welfare. Now, without the entitlement, states can go ahead and pass laws that are explicitly aimed at keeping women who receive public assistance from having more children. You know, we talk about laws like this in China, government policy to keep people from having a certain number of children. Well, we've got that in many states of the United States as well. Also, in the last 20 years, there's continued the astronomical buildup of the prison population in the United States. So this was something other than my discussion of the criminalization of Black women for using drugs during pregnancy. I didn't really talk about the prison system. Today, I have to include the prison system as one of the institutions that is punishes Black women for having children and regulates Black women's childbearing. Women's incarceration has increased 646%, even a greater increase. Of course, there are fewer women in prison than men, but it's an even greater increase in percentage of, in the rate of incarceration among women. And Black women are, especially Black mothers, are the fastest growing segment of the prison population in the United States. And incarcerated women's reproductive decisions are regulated, and their childbearing a site of violence in a number of respects. And I'll just mention a couple. One is the shackling of incarcerated women during delivery. The policy that still exists in a number of states that when women go into labor, they are shackled, maybe handcuffed, maybe leg shackled, some both legs and hands strapped to the bed so that they can't move during labor. Needless to say, this is a form of torture that has absolutely no purpose, because it is these women are not at risk of fleeing, during labor. And of course, there are other ways to secure them than strapping them down to the delivery bed. The other is barriers to visitation of their children. There's a widespread belief that incarcerated women are bad mothers and therefore don't deserve a relationship with their children. And so it's very hard for incarcerated mothers to maintain a relationship with their children because of a slew of policies that are barriers to it. While I was working on Killing the Black Body, I became aware of the disproportionate number of Black children in the foster care system in the United States. And I was shocked. At the time that I began doing research on it in the late 1990s, Black children were 4 times as likely as white children to be placed in foster care. And I began to see foster care as a system very much like prison. A carceral system that punishes struggling mothers for the disadvantages of their children instead of providing the resources and the social change that's needed for people to be able to raise and care for families. I found that the decision to rely on foster care, that is removal of children from their homes, instead of providing services to families and other ways of creating a society where people don't have to struggle just to raise their kids, that is a political choice. And foster care became more and more of the choice for child welfare policymakers as Black families entered the system. In other words, as more and more Black children came into the child welfare system, it became more and more punitive and relied more and more on foster care as opposed to services and resources to intact families. And there's lots of evidence that this stems in part from beliefs that Black families don't have loving relationships with each other. I mean, I've seen this in so many contexts working in the child welfare system, where there is a sense that foster care may not be perfect, but it's better for Black children than staying in their communities. And so welfare restructuring, prison, and foster care all combine to create a risk of losing children permanently. And conversely, the involvement of Black mothers in all of these systems becomes a way of justifying maintaining these systems as necessary to prevent the biological threat that Black mothers pose to their families, their communities, and even to the nation as a whole. Gene editing has now come on the scene, so that high-tech reproduction isn't just about being able to have a baby, it's about being able to have a perfect baby. And just like those images of the fertility business always were images of white children, if it was promoting the technologies, the images of the perfect baby, just check it out. They're images of white babies. And they usually like those images that's promoting the fertility industry. They accentuate, the white purity. The babies have blue eyes and blonde hair. They claim to be able to increase the intelligence and the athletic ability and the morality and every good thing about these babies. But we need to be concerned, I think, about promoting gene editing as now a new way of avoiding the need to grapple with social change. The people who have a stake in gene editing are those who have the least stake in changing society. And the people who have the most stake in changing society, poor people, people of color, people with disabilities, they have not been at the table to shape gene editing policy. And many would argue that there should be a moratorium on gene editing for reproductive purposes. That is, gene editing that can actually change the genome of future generations. So at the end of Killing the Black Body, I call for a radical vision of reproductive justice. I'm kind of, so when I went back, I said, wow, I actually used that term in the book. And I said that we should explore how social justice could be made central to, here I was talking to people who write and think about reproductive freedom. So their conception of rights, of harms, and of the value of procreation. And I criticized the use of choice as the primary framework for advocating for reproductive freedom. Choice tends to strip away the social and political context in which people make reproductive decisions. It pretends that we can make choices and they just magically can happen. And it privileges the most privileged people who have the resources and the support of society, whose choices are seen as valued. And so choice, I think, is not only an inadequate way of thinking about reproductive freedom, I think it's a harmful way. Because if the legal barriers, the bans on certain choices are removed, it leaves the impression that then everyone should be all right. And if you still aren't all right, then you must have made a bad choice. It's your fault. It's very much like, it's a very neoliberal type of way of thinking, that the market operates fairly, so we just have to give everybody access to the market, and then if you can't make it, if your kids still get put in foster care, if you get incarcerated, if you aren't able to get the health care you need, it's because you just are inadequate. You're not responsible. You make bad choices. And so it allows for the continuation of the status quo, which is unjust, and even for the punishment of people whose only crime is their disadvantaged status in society. Reproductive justice relies profoundly on intersectionality theory, and I thought I would mention the Combahee River Collective Statement, which is celebrating its 40th anniversary this year, which very presciently described a praxis of struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and called for an integrated analysis of these interlocking systems of oppression. And reproductive justice strives to do that. It recognizes that, that the experiences and leadership of women of color who have been the most attuned to these interlocking systems of oppression is important to analyzing and advocating for reproductive freedom, and includes both the right to have or not have children and to parent them in safe and healthy environments. And it is part of a struggle for social justice and human rights. It's not an isolated protection to choose a particular reproductive option. It's integrated within a struggle for social change, for a more just society. And so in the last 20 years, we saw the coining of the term reproductive justice in 1994 by a group of Black feminist activists at a women's rights meeting. The founding of organizations like Sister Song, Reproductive Justice Collective, the March for Women's Lives in 2004, which was led by women of color. Loretta Ross in particular took the strategic lead, and it included lots of women of color activists. Oh, that's me right there. With Julia Scott, who was then the president of the Black Women's Health Project. And it's also included successful actions like the Trust Black Women campaign, which put up billboards in opposite, well, first took down billboards, those anti-abortion billboards around the country, but then put up in their place billboards. This is Sister Reach's billboard in Memphis. I don't deserve to be shamed for my reproductive health decisions, including the decision to have an abortion, and trust me to make the best decisions for myself, my family, and my community, resisting the idea that Black women are dangers to themselves, their families, and their communities. Okay, I'm gonna close by reading the last paragraph of my preface for the new edition of Killing the Black Body. And I have no idea if I'm interpreting Octavia Butler correctly. I may be completely wrong, and this isn't as optimistic as I think it is, but this is how I choose to interpret her. So I end the preface to the new edition by writing, a social justice focus provides a concrete basis for building radical coalitions between reproductive rights activists and organizations fighting for racial, economic, and environmental justice for immigrant, queer, and people with disabilities, and for systemic change in law enforcement, healthcare, and education. True reproductive freedom requires a living wage, universal health care, and the abolition of prisons. Black women see the police slaughter of unarmed people in their communities as a reproductive justice issue. At their core, reproductive justice and Black Lives Matter both insist that U.S. society must begin to value Black people's humanity. The great science fiction novelist Octavia Butler wrote, "There's nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns." And I think of the nothing new under the sun, the continuation of these same ideologies and ways of thinking about Black women's bodies, from slavery till today. But the new suns that we can create is the other side of what Butler envisioned. In the face of withering state repression, the reproductive justice movement continues Black women's long struggle for liberation that has always pointed the way to new suns. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Roberts, for your remarks. And we're going to continue the conversation with Columbia faculty and students. And first we have Lauren Broussard, who is a PhD candidate at the Mailman School of Public Health. We have Dr. Selina Makana, who's a postdoctoral fellow, Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality. Dr. Alonda Nelson, who's professor of Sociology and Gender Studies, and the president of the Social Science Research Council. And then we have Anthony Ureña, who is a PhD candidate, Department of Sociology here at Columbia University.
It is truly an honor to sing the praises of Dorothy Roberts and Killing the Black Body. We cannot know for sure how many people have been transformed by this incredible work. For so many of us, across institutions and disciplines, Dorothy Roberts' scholarship regarding the reproductive health, rights, and freedom, or lack thereof, of Black women has inspired, informed, and guided our work. Dorothy Roberts is a trailblazer of truth-telling. Through her own willingness to speak honestly on issues of race and gender-based discrimination, and her courage in confronting the people and structures that compromise the freedom of Black women, Dorothy Roberts has provided an example for all of us who are or who aspire to do the work. Beyond your hard work and commitment to equity and justice, Professor Roberts, you have given a voice to the inner turmoil that many Black women have experienced. Many of us felt from an early age that we were not being treated fairly in this world. Inside of us, there has been an aching sense of being wronged, devalued, mistreated. We have endured the impact of generational discrimination and the abuse and the wear and tear of centuries of violation upon our bodies. We know in our collective hearts, minds, bodies, and spirits a truth about our experience. And we thank you, Professor Roberts, for putting these internally known truths into words and down on paper. In the introduction to Killing the Black Body, you wrote, Black motherhood has borne the weight of centuries of disgrace, manufactured in political culture, in popular culture and academic circles. A lurid mythology of Black mothers' unfitness, along with a science devoted to proving Black biological inferiority, cast Black childbearing as a dangerous activity. This view justified the regulation of every aspect of Black women's fertility. 20 years on, Killing the Black Body is just as valuable and full of wisdom as ever. In preparation for this event, I revisited the book and was both alarmed and comforted by its timeliness. Alarmed because during the previous administration, many of us hoped that we were at least making progress, even as we continued to catalog the pattern of abuse faced by Black women. Today, though, we face a fresh and reinvigorated environment of hostility towards and hyperregulation of Brown and Black people and women's bodies. Yet I am comforted to have Killing the Black Body as a guide and Dorothy Roberts as a leader and example as we continue our walk towards equity. I am also comforted to see a room full of friendly faces and colleagues who are active and committed to this work. When I began my work in the field of public health several years ago now, I was a student intern at a community-based organization in New Orleans that served people living with HIV and AIDS. All I wanted to do was hand out condoms and spread the good news of safer sex. I was fortunate to be able to parlay this passion into a career in the federal government, but I kept hitting the same barrier and feeling the same frustration. The issue is not the behavior of irresponsible individuals. Our focus should be upon, and I quote, the unjust social order that causes harm and increases risk to those among us who are most vulnerable. Handing out condoms isn't going to cut it. About public health policies that focus on restricting Black sexuality and reproduction, you wrote, the chief danger of these policies is the legitimation of an oppressive social structure. You asked us, why the rush to forfeit women's health for the good of society? And you told us, perhaps the answer lies in the poverty and race of the women being sacrificed. Today I find myself in school again, and still frustrated and wondering, how do we fight this monster that feels so much bigger than us? How do we achieve equity when it feels like the target is always moving? When policies and people, the leaders of this country, say one thing and do another. My work now focuses on the reproductive health impact of racist and regressive welfare and drug policy. Policies intended to be specifically punitive to poor Black and brown people. Policies that are a product of 4 centuries of structural oppression. Policies about which our government does not tell the truth, though their practices are transparent. In some recent dark and worried moments, I have returned to the many flagged and highlighted pages of my personal copy of Killing the Black Body. What you in this book taught me is to think critically and use history to see beyond the words that are being spoken, to deduce the truth. Welfare policy is supposed to be about poverty, yet it starts off by telling us that marriage is the foundation of a healthy society. It wasn't until 5 minutes ago that I would have thought of choice as a problematic neoliberal ideology, but I'm here for it. We must tell the truth about oppression and this country's fundamental commitment to racism and misogyny. We must tell the truth about what is happening in our communities and to our bodies. We must be radically fearless in our practice of telling the truth. This is what Killing the Black Body taught me. I will conclude with a quote from our guest of honor. For too long, Black women's struggle against the most degrading repression has been left out of the official story of reproductive rights in America. But it is their struggle that highlights the poverty of current notions of reproductive freedom. It is also their struggle that can lead to a more radical vision of reproductive justice. As I have tried to show through this book, a vision of liberty that respects the reproductive integrity of Black women is a critical step towards a just society for everyone. It is truly a pleasure to honor you and the legacy of your incredible work. Thank you.
I'll just present while seated. Hope you can see me. Thank you, everyone, and I'd also like to join my fellow panelists in saying thank you for those who organize and work behind the scene to organize this wonderful event and just bringing us together. And thank you, Professor Roberts, for honoring us with your presence and bringing us together because of this path-breaking work that continues to, shape our intellectual journeys even to this day. And so, I first encountered Killing the Black Body in the early 2000s as an undergraduate back in Kenya. That's where I am from. And not that the professors assigned the text to in any of our classes, but I was visiting one of my favorite professors at the time during the office hours, and I saw this book, immaculately displayed on the shelf. And what caught my attention was the title itself, Killing the Black Body. And I was fixated on the word killing and body, black body. And I wondered, what is black? And as most of us know, those of us from the continent, we don't know we're black until we set foot at the JFK, for example, right? And so, little did I know that I'll be encountering this text later on in my life. And so then, fast forward a decade later, I hope I'm not outing how old I am. I encountered Killing the Black Body in my critical race theory and gender studies classes as a first-year grad student at UC Berkeley. And as an international student from Kenya at the time, I was extremely excited, yet surprised at how relevant the book was to the experiences of women in East Africa in terms of the relationship between reproductive rights and politics, and especially how politicians and churches and other religious organizations, engage in these discourses and practices that directly police and control women, and how women talk about their own bodies and in terms of their childbearing choices. I also found Killing the Black Body to be such a crucial text in the sense that it offered a framework of thinking about reproductive freedom through a lens of social justice and not just individual choice. Because also at the time I was also working for an NGO, an Italian NGO, which we were distributing condoms as well. And so, sorry, thank you. And so, although Killing the Black Body details, thank you. So, although Killing the Black Body details US-specific cases of the history of restrictive policies targeting Black women from slavery to the present day, we see this war against women's reproduction and blaming them for their underclass status taking place in other regions across the globe. And so I would like to offer my reflection on Killing the Black Body from a transnational perspective by focusing primarily on African women in East and Southern Africa. Those are my research sites, and specifically Kenya and Uganda, and Namibia and Angola in Southern Africa. I will do so by highlighting one area where we witness a systematic assault on the bodies of women by different states and healthcare providers on the continent, and that is forced or coercive sterilization of women living with HIV/AIDS. Women's right to make reproductive choices are stipulated in the constitution of the 4 countries I've mentioned above, and are endorsed in the various human rights charters and conventions, which the 4 countries, of course, are signatories to. Especially Article 14 of the African Women Protocol, a charter of the African Union, AU, which emphasizes the importance of women's right to control their fertility, the right to decide whether to have children, the number of children to have, how to space the children, the right to choose any method of contraception. Yet, despite these stipulations, women living with HIV and AIDS continue to encounter discriminatory attitudes from healthcare institutions about their childbearing choices. It is against this backdrop of high HIV prevalence amongst women in the sub-Saharan region that there have been reports from women rights organizations that the ministries of health in the specific countries, that is Uganda, Kenya, Namibia, and Angola, and certain health practitioners have been sterilizing women living with HIV and AIDS against their will. This is at least from 2002 to recently up to 2016. In Kenya, for example, 4 HIV-positive women who are forcibly sterilized sued the government and 2 international NGOs, that's Doctors Without Borders, MSF, and Marie Stopes International, who they claim referred them to state hospitals, Pumwani specifically, where sterilization occurred between 2005 and 2010. In the lawsuit, the survivors claimed that the healthcare providers at the maternity hospitals had told them that they would not qualify for food portions or milk formula for their babies if they refused to undergo this procedure. So in all the documented cases, informed consent was not adequately obtained due to several factors, including consent, which was obtained under duress. Medical personnel provided misinformation, if they ever provided any at all. And consent was also invalid because most of the women could not read or write. And in the Angolan case specifically, I remember interviewing in 2015 one of the members of the NGO, leaders of the NGO, who told me that women with disabilities and who are living with HIV and AIDS were rarely provided with informed consent because healthcare providers do not bother to give them this consent because of the belief that disabled women living with HIV and AIDS should not have children. And so, what does reproductive freedom and liberty really mean for different groups of women, especially poor, the disabled, and those living with HIV and AIDS in sub-Saharan Africa? So I would like to conclude by drawing our attention to an incident that happened recently in the summer, and I'm sure most of us are aware of it, which the media called a stumble, okay, when the then newly elected president of France, Emmanuel Macron, during the G20 meeting in Hamburg in June, during this meeting, a journalist asked Macron why Africa did not deserve a Marshall Plan, which helped rebuild most European countries or nations after World War II. And Macron gave a disturbing yet all too familiar response, and I quote, "The challenge of Africa, it is totally different. It is much deeper. It is civilizational." And so he went ahead and listed at least, I could count then 8 problems that he considered to be African problems. And on top of the list were wars, failed states, Islamic terrorism, and so many others, which just made my blood boil. But he wrapped up his monologue about problems in Africa by saying that when countries still have 7 to 8 children per woman, you can decide to spend billions of euros, but you'll not stabilize anything. Unquote. So by blaming overpopulation for poverty and African women for high birth rates, Macron's obtuse and condescending comments distract us from the roles played by colonial powers and the violent and aggressive imposition of neoliberal policies on post-colonial African states through structural adjustment programs. So Macron not only perpetuates the myth of Black women's hyperfertility, but he also uses biological explanations for inequality to persuade us into thinking that the socioeconomic inequalities in Africa stem from African women's individual choices, that is the choice to have 7 to 8 babies, and not institutionalized and structural issues, which more often than not serve the interests of global North hegemonic powers and white supremacy. So I'd like to end by just asking us to think about how we can, forge a transnational solidarity, networks around reproductive freedom, knowing that what's going on in Africa specifically and how the global North frames African women as being the source of the problems of Africa as a whole. Thank you.
How to follow these brilliant young sisters is difficult. So I guess I first want to say thank you all for coming. This is the first event ever of the Columbia Collaborative to advance equity through research on women and girls of color. We have a little bit of money. But we are trying, and so I want to thank my co-chair, Farah Jasmine Griffin, and Michelle Knight-Manuel is on our advisory board, Lauren Broussard, Anna Hildago, Vina Tran, who really all brought this together, and we are really doing it on a shoestring budget, but we're doing it, and we're so glad you're here. And we couldn't think of anybody more than Dorothy to really symbolize what we're trying to accomplish here through being a community of women of color scholars at the university that traverse the entire university, law school, public health school, arts and sciences, teachers college, Barnard, SIPA. So thank you, Dorothy. Thank you. So this is going to be personal more than intellectual, although they're combined. Before I started, I also wanted to point out that our, Farah found for us as our sort of slogan for CAETR, as we call it, this beautiful passage from a Gwendolyn Brooks poem, even now surmise, she rises in the sunshine, there she goes. So I was struck by your use of new suns and sunshine in the Octavia Butler. So yes, there we go. It's all about new suns. Okay, so I first read, I'm old, so I read Killing the Black Body when it first came out. I was in graduate school. It was the new book that had just come out that was like burning through my cohort in graduate school that everyone had to read. And so I read it in 1977 as a second year graduate. 1997. 1997. I've got Combahee on my head. On my mind. When I was a second year graduate student downtown at New York University, and it was transformative, a transformative experience for the reasons that I'll mention. When I finished my written comprehensive exams the next year, all 3 of my essays were articulated through the framework of Black women's perspective. So in a year's time, it had really allowed me to think about and shape my work in new ways, in part because Dorothy accomplishes in this project lots of different intersections, right? And it was to bring together sort of history and Black feminism and science all together was, I'd never seen a book that had ever done that before. And if you know anything about my work, you know that it changed and really shaped what I do. So I met Dorothy, I think in 1999 or 2000 at a conference. I was one of throngs of people who were coming up to her afterwards to talk to her as a graduate student. I was then and am still terribly awkward and probably said something like, I'm a graduate student, like, so not even like a full sentence. And Dorothy was then and is now, the kindest scholar I've ever known. Yes. And so, I'm trying not to cry, but I got my tissue. So in that moment, with all these people around, Dorothy said, tell me what you work on. And I said, I'm working on the Black Panther Party. She said, that sounds like a really important project. Keep in touch and let me know how it goes. And, for any scholar, for any writer, but for a graduate student, it's just the biggest gift you can get. And so I've been grateful since that moment to you and admiring of you since that moment. I now know that I probably wouldn't have tenure without you. Dorothy's been really like helping me out for a very long time, writing those letters and such. And so I hope that this evening begins the long work of beginning to repay the gratitude that so many of us owe to you for your courage and for your kindness. So I want to say a few words about what Dorothy taught me. She taught me not to believe what they say about us. And this point is really, for me, personal about generation. It's about being a young woman of color and a Black woman growing up in the Reagan era, growing up with visions all around you of crack mothers and welfare queens, and not knowing what to do about that, but sort of grieve it and live in that space. And when I read Killing the Black Body, I realized that I had been living for a decade or more with a kind of sense of shame around the like racist and sexist ideology of that time. And it wasn't until I read Dorothy's book that I was able to name and sort of release that shame, and also to really understand that something could be done about it. Like I actually didn't realize that it only had to be sort of accepted. And we, by 97, it had sort of gone away as being the central thing of US sort of ideology in the news, although there was another iteration of it, of course. But, I think those two caricatures were a particular kind of calling out of one's name for women of my generation to be in high school and college in that time. And so that book, really just, sort of opened something up in me about the possibility of scholarship being able to tell the truth. She showed me how to speak truth to power. From the very first page, the very first paragraph of the book, Dorothy Roberts calls out and challenges the degradation of Black women and Black women's reproduction and continues it for 200 pages. And continues it with the most searing prose, but also the most rigorous interrogation of archival records, of media files. It epitomizes, excellent research. She taught me that one could and should lay claims to the ideals that U.S. society claims for itself. So it took me a long time to really wrap my head around the kind of the meaning of liberty piece. Like there was a kind of democratic claim being made there that it kind of took a minute to wrap my head around. You know, it's about liberty as a constitutional right, liberty as a societal ideal, and liberty as claimed for Black women, right? And that liberty is not working if it can't be claimed by Black women, and if Black women aren't living in a space of liberty. And so that would very much shape, you know, the way that I endeavored to write about the Black Panther Party's health activism in my book, Body and Soul, which was really about laying claim to what they were saying about citizenship and what their relationship to the state, and sort of, it allowed me to listen to them about that, and listen actually to, I think, other Black nationalists. I mean, when I'm talking about the book, I show this picture of Marcus Garvey's Black Cross nurses carrying a UNIA flag and the American flag, right? So this sort of like this sort of interesting critique and tension happening at the same time that was apparent even in the Black Panthers' work, and it was certainly for me the model of your work that you know, allowed me to lay claim to the critique of citizenship that was being made, I think, in the Black Panthers' health activism. So I thank you for that. You taught us as well, and me as well, to fight for the dignity and liberty of Black women, of Black children, of Black families. This is pioneering Black feminist work at a time when we'd had a lot of really great Black feminist work. I mean, so to sort of have work that like is really opening up a new space in and of itself is just an incredible thing for you know, for that moment in your work. But for me, and the sort of particular interest of my work, you did so while also doing pioneering work in the history and sociology of science. And so this work really begins there, and a lot of your work after that really takes this up. You showed us that science and biological science is ideological, that science is about race and racism, and you showed for me a kind of new intersection that wasn't available for work that I mentioned previously around science and biology through a critical lens around history and around race and gender that I think had rarely been done before, and I think it had not been done before, frankly, and opened up a space for you know, generations of new scholarship, the scholarship I do, the scholarship that some of us sitting here all do. And lastly, I just want to say, and Lauren said a version of this, that what I learned from Dorothy is to do the work. So I sometimes, you know, in our Black feminist scholarly circles, women of color scholarly circles, we lament how much of our work is stolen by institutions, how much of it is stolen by the toll of, you know, sort of being engaged in warfare constantly and your life and in institutions. Dorothy Roberts has published more than 6 books. Dorothy Roberts has published scores of articles, right? And so, you know, so do the work that's rigorous and plentiful is what you taught me. Do chosen intellectual work that can be a kind of self-care and not only a kind of robbery or a kind of excavation of the self. There's so much of your work. You leave so much for us to learn from. You leave so much behind. You will leave so much for generations behind, books and articles and chapters and the multitudes. So I think the biggest lesson, particularly at this stage in my career, is that a scholar activist doesn't have to be robbed of her work. And that I look to you as a role model, as someone who does the work as the part of the work of transformation, as part of the work that tries to cherish and honor Black women's liberty. Thank you.
Thank you.
So it's impossible to follow up with after that. But good afternoon, everyone. And I just want to thank Dorothy Roberts and this fantastic panel for all the wisdom, the brilliance, everything that's just been shared so far in this wondrous event today. Let me first start off by saying how grateful I am to even be sitting here in honor and celebration of the phenomenal work of Professor Dorothy Roberts. So when Dr. Alonda Nelson, my advisor and dissertation committee chair, very, very good.
You're going to be on this panel on November 20th.
When she asked me, I said yes without a single ounce of hesitation. Professor Roberts holds a place in my personal pantheon of scholars whose work has been instrumental in my growth as a sociologist of health and illness. In fact, Killing the Body and other related publications of hers were some of the first social scientific texts I read that resonated with me as strongly as my biology and chemistry textbooks used to do. You see, not too long ago, I once aspired to become a medical practitioner. In 2008, I entered my first year of undergraduate study at Brown University with the sole intention of following the pre-medical track. A wide-eyed, overachieving freshman with a genuine love for the life sciences, I quickly devoured the program's required coursework by the end of my sophomore year, ultimately finding myself with an unshakable dissatisfaction with all that I had learned. Despite the complexity of the materials I had mastered, it all felt shallow to me. My desire to pursue a career in medicine was driven by an urge to undo the pain that illness had wrought on my family over the years. An uncle I had lost to an infection. An aunt I had lost to a hospital's mismanagement of her surgery. And a father I had lost to diabetes. Late nights in the campus library, I try and imagine how I'd actually go about figuring out this undoing of the pain, but the only answers I ever found were the solutions to the problem sets that lay before me. And so I found myself at a crossroads. Do I spend my remaining college years digging deeper into science in search of an unnamed truth, or do I dare to explore another field and let that truth find me instead? I thankfully chose the latter. At the behest of my academic counselor at the time, I took a course on the sociology of medicine, and it was in that classroom that I would discover the passion I had been searching for. It was the first time I had seriously recognized that the agonies my family endured had been suffered by many others like them, in patterns traced along the lines of identity and class. I learned about the existence and persistence of health inequalities, on the disproportionate ways in which some communities bear the weight of sickness more so than others, and the work social scientists do in hopes of uncovering the reasons why this is so. During one of the weeks we spent discussing the intersections of race, gender, and health, Professor Roberts' Killing the Black Body was a subject of discussion. We discussed the ways in the different aspects of reproductive health, such as fertility rates and maternal mortality, were strong indicators for the overall well-being of a nation. In incorporating Professor Roberts' work, we asked ourselves, how can we possibly talk about reproductive health policy without addressing race as well as gender? A question she poses at the very beginning of this book. We paid careful attention to the experiences of Black women in America, examining the myriad ways over the centuries in which their reproduction had been constricted, practices that would be influential in defining a prejudiced conceptualization of reproductive freedom. Killing the Black Body urged us to push back against this by considering how, to quote Dr. Roberts, we make reproductive decisions within a social context, because reproductive freedom is a matter of social justice, not individual's choice. By the end of this introductory course, I had decided to double major in human biology and sociology. I embarked upon a journey to curate my own form of sociological imagination that was poised to analyze and address health disparities. So taking Professor Roberts' words to heart, I made sure to always look towards the social context to see what clues it could provide into making sense of inequity. Fortunately for me, I was able to take a course titled The Social Context of Disease. How convenient, right? That would show me just how to do this. And once again, Professor Roberts' wisdom was called upon. This time was relation to the adoption and adherence to pharmaceutical technologies among members of marginalized communities. We return to the experiences of Black women, citing Dr. Roberts' writings on the reasons for birth control resistance at the advent of the development of the pill. To quote from her 2000 paper in Family Planning Perspectives, Black women's attitudes about the pill are shaped by a broader social context that includes racial injustice and gender inequality. The pill was introduced at a time when scientists were promoting genetic explanations of racial differences in intelligence. And during the 1960s and 1970s, thousands of poor Black women were coercively sterilized, the termination of their welfare benefits being their only other ultimatum. By considering this reality, it should therefore be unsurprising why many Black women did not trust the pill, but viewed it instead as a tool to be used against their well-being. In reading through and witnessing the impact of research and writing such as this, it became clear to me that I needed to make a career shift. Rather than become a medical practitioner, I would follow in the footsteps of the scholars who had enlightened me at a time when I felt uninspired. I would aspire to become a doctor of a different breed. So fast forward a bit closer to today. In 2012, I began my first year as a PhD student here at Sociology at Columbia University. As you've probably already guessed, Professor Roberts' work appeared once more to guide me along the path towards a life of impactful research and pedagogy. During Professor Nelson's seminar on the political sociology of science and medicine, we discussed Dr. Roberts' book, Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. This work in particular was crucial to my understanding of race as a socially constructed political grouping that, despite not being fully rooted in biology, still has very real impacts on the lived experiences of individuals. It was the first piece of scholarship that exposed me to the ways in which medical institutions attempt to mobilize statistics and technologies to cement racial differences as immutable molecular realities, such as the case with Vital, the heart failure medication that was marketed as being specifically for African Americans, despite there being no actual biochemical difference in that pill to support that fact. It was the first book to show me the dangers of this kind of biological essentialism and the social realities that are obfuscated when scientists pay closer attention to the pairing of amino acids than they do to the relationship between people and their harmful environments.
All right now.
To quote Dr. Roberts once more from her article in the Minnesota Journal of Law, Science and Technology, attributing health inequalities to genetic difference is part of a new biopolitics of race that is focusing on race at the molecular level while discounting its impact on society. This process, she argues, can make social inequities seem natural, but when it comes to health disparities, our focus should be on the social causes of these gaps. This argument, a veritable claim to intellectual arms, and real arms too, is at the heart of my current dissertation research. My work concerns itself with HIV/AIDS in particular. We have a nice commonality here with the prior experiences. Right? Yes, condom giving out, yeah. My work concerns itself with HIV/AIDS in particular, examining the ways in which an individual's social location impacts their perception of disease risk, and how this process relates to the persistence of disparities in infection rates. Since the inception of the epidemic, HIV/AIDS has been understood to pose a serious risk to health and the livelihood of individuals, accounting for thousands of deaths yearly. However, HIV/AIDS risk is not universally perceived by all individuals as a cause for concern. A recent report detailed the experiences of homeless LGBTQ youth in New York City who actively sought HIV/AIDS infection in order to qualify for state provision benefits such as food, shelter, and medication. Another study on inner-city African-American youth in Detroit demonstrated how low-income individuals actively sought HIV infection to gain state provision benefits as well as an increased sense of closeness or intimacy with their HIV-positive family members. Given all that is known about the severity of HIV/AIDS and its complications it can introduce into an individual's life, that infection could be viewed as a benefit rather than a cost suggests that HIV/AIDS risk perception is more complex than would be expected. So what other perceptions of HIV/AIDS exist, and from where does this diversity in risk perception stem? In considering the state of the epidemic in the United States today, it is necessary to note that Black and Latino men who have sex with men have historically and continue to be disproportionately affected by HIV/AIDS. The overall decline in HIV infections across the general population has been attributed to innovations in treatment and prevention technologies like pre-exposure prophylaxis, better known as the PrEP pill. Nevertheless, epidemiological reports show that despite these advancements, Black men who have sex with men account for the most new infections at 10,000 yearly, and Latino infection rates are rising 2.4% yearly. My dissertation adopts a social cultural approach to risk analysis that hones in on the intricacies of risk perception to better understand this disparity. So to do this work, I've been interviewing the young men who fit this demographic category to gain a better sense of their social world and to amplify the voices that are shrouded by the numbers of epidemiological reports. Additionally, I have also been volunteering with a health advocacy group by and for queer men of color. Dr. Roberts' erudition has already arisen to aid me in the early analyses of the data I've collected thus far. I hear echoes of her wisdom when an interviewee calls the PrEP pill birth control for HIV, and follows up with a confession of how the overt marketing of the pill to people of color in particular made him trust it even less. I catch glimpses of her knowledge in the fears my interviewees relay about the inevitability of becoming HIV positive, because the CDC statistics suggest it is only a matter of time before they're next. I feel her hope for a just future when I observe members of this community organizing healing spaces for themselves and their loved ones. Professor Dorothy Roberts' work has revolutionized the way I see the world, my place in it, and my power to contribute to it. Though I still have quite a bit of work left to do, I am motivated by the promise of a society that is ready to reconcile with its injustices and create actionable change to protect the health of our most vulnerable. I sincerely thank Professor Roberts for showing me that there are other ways to heal that lie beyond the operating room.
As I was listening to our panelists share, two thoughts came to mind. The first one was, I heard another colleague once say, like, we wait until people die before we give them praise and honor. And I just thought about how important it is to have moments like this so you can know and understand really the impact you're having. And then the second thing that came to mind, maybe because of the holidays coming up or whatever, but is George Bailey and the thought of your life wasn't here.
Oh.
The fact of that all the people's lives that you impact because you are here. And sometimes we don't know that. Yeah. And I just think about, as so many have said, about the ways we think about Black women and how you tore that apart to really give us hope. And just understanding the impact on the daily lives of people by writing this book. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank you.
And as we move further into the conversation, we just want to offer the opportunity for those of you who would like to ask questions to share your questions with us. And hopefully Dorothy Roberts and the panel will share it.
Can I just interject first to just say thank you to these magnificent panelists. It's always such an honor when other people can describe your book even better than you can, and then, because of their brilliance, it sounds even better than it was. And it's also so inspiring to see all of you who I consider young people, including you, Alonda, taking ideas that I wrote in the book and their own, and moving forward in such an exciting way. I'm just honored that my work had anything to do with any of your work, because it's all so inspiring and hopeful. And I just thank you for the honor of being here and what you said. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you all for coming. This was really insightful. I just have a question about just us as women of color. How can we personally respond to the ways in which we are attacked? For example, I had an experience a few weeks ago at Columbia Health where the gynecologist, she kind of shamed me for making the choice of discontinuing hormonal birth control. I have a strong family history of breast cancer. I'm from the Bahamas, and we have some of the highest rates of breast cancer in the world. I got my first breast biopsy at 21 years old, and this year I've had a surgery to remove, lumps from my breast. And I was advised basically that, just by me continuously taking birth control, that is just fueling, the problem. And basically she shamed me for making that choice for myself. And I just kept quiet, and I just, saw her facial expression and, her idea of like, this girl is crazy. And thinking about that, like, how could, I guess, we as women embrace, these situations, because these things happen all the time to all of us, and a lot of times we don't really think about it. We just carry the shame with us. And a part of doing the work, and I guess, and my idea is also to be personal, to also, in these interactions, how can I help that person to see it a little bit differently?
Well, I'll start. I'm sure others have more to say, but just one of the observations I made about everyone who spoke is the way in which sharing our stories helps us understand that they're not just individual stories, just something happening just to us, that it's happening to other women of color as well, and in some cases men of color as well, and then placing it in both a personal but also political context. I think that's something that I was struck by the comments today. Everything integrated the personal and political. Mm-hmm. And some ways that I heard that we can address it is, number one, to know that you shouldn't feel ashamed for making that decision, that there's a basis for it, and also understanding there's a basis for the reaction you got from the doctor. Coming together either in some kind of a smaller group. Black Women's Health Project has a history of self-care groups of Black women coming together to share their experiences and give each other encouragement and advice, but also working in organizations, various kinds of organizations. They may be in universities like the one that Farah and Alonda have begun here at Columbia. There's also what Alonda was talking about, the YWCA organization with this sister here, and or national organization, some way of organizing to address the conditions and the ideologies and the structures that produce those personal encounters. So I was struck by those multiple levels that I heard among the panelists of how we can address these experiences that we have individually, but that we know are also shared by others and that are produced by inequities that we can collectively fight to end for everybody.
So thank you for coming. My name is Rahema. I'm a grad student at Mailman right now, my second year in SMS. So this question is kind of directed at you, but everyone can answer as well. I've just recently started doing research in the HIV Center, and I'm working with perinatally infected HIV adolescents, and it's been very new for me because I'm used to just like being very hands-on, like in the actual clinic, handing out condoms and such. So what I've been since we sort of talk about condoms, I know. So for me, I think I'm just wondering how to make that transition. Because one of the things that I often struggle with is like feeling as though at the end of the day I'm going home with just like with just having conversations with youth, and then like afterwards I just leave. I don't know if this is like really something, research is very, very new for me. So I stayed away from it because I feared that I would have this issue and like not knowing whether I was actually making a difference, but without like having to publish a book, like using my word, like using the research I found. So if anyone can like answer that, or talk to that.
I'll start just because we're in the same department in the same school, doing similar work. I think that's a very valid concern. It's one that I feel all the time, the dangers and numbing effect of being in the ivory tower. So I think part of it is, using works like Killing the Black Body to know that you're not crazy. And also, and I'm, happy to initiate this with you, just holding space together. I see my sisters in the academy and in the professional spaces I've been in as anchors. And so having someone who gets it to debrief with. I think the third thing I would say, and I try to hold on to this, it's hard when you're in grad school, but volunteering or doing something where you get to stay in touch, because I think sometimes we can get pulled so far away from the reason we even started doing the work. So, and there's multiple opportunities to do that here in New York. Probably shouldn't say this into a microphone, but I try to do that as far away from Columbia as possible. Just because this is not how people are living in New York, right? This isn't it. And this is not the space that I want my work to resonate in. So, but yeah, we should talk more because SMS. All right.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, jumping really quickly. I shared a similar concern with you as well too coming in, and I think the solution to that is just like taking time for yourself and figuring out what it is that meaningful work looks like to you, especially if you care about that particular sector and what it is that impact might look like. And that can just be a matter of imagining something like, I want to create a program that's targeted specifically for this community that's like in Brooklyn or something like that. As particular, just imagining it and speaking with those who, others in your program too, others who are in your network, and trying to create those spaces. Part of my field work has led me to similar spaces like that, and it's given me that sort of sense of fulfillment I was worried I wouldn't get. For me, I know it's okay for others, but I didn't find any sort of empowerment in statistical analyses. You know, like they're easy to do. They're easy to do and easy to say, like, create policy based off X value says that. But then when you talk to people, the lives behind those numbers, it's so much more complex. So in talking to individuals and volunteering at organizations, I see what that complexity looks like, and that's what's valuable for me. So.
Hello, my name is Ranisha Blashe. I'm an interdisciplinary doctoral student at Teachers College. My professor's here. Formerly known as the Cotton Girl. And my question is, being someone who is a victim of this scenario, and I won't go into detail about it, but just the idea that doing away with medical care from the medical profession and looking into holistic medicine, how reliable is that? Being that I know it steers away from the traditional medicine, however, there's still a body of knowledge that's being pulled from. So I'm wondering, how much should we rely on the holistic medicine of today, if you will? That's what
That's a very technical question. I feel like no, it's okay. It's I think it's a good question. I just don't know if we're equipped to answer it. But I would say that part of the work that I've done, I think others have done, is to question the authority, the morality, the justice of the mainstream medical profession and institution. A lot of what we've been talking about, the violations we've talked about, are actually done by doctors and other medical staff. So and that's not even getting into the way in which medicine and the healthcare system has systematically violated Black people's rights and humanity, again, beginning in slavery until today. So we should question the authority of the medical profession. I don't feel equipped to answer your specific question about particular forms of holistic medicine, but I think that we need to be critical and we need to work toward transformation of that profession and the healthcare system, including one part of it that I have been involved with is the ability of midwives and doulas to practice where there is evidence that if they were attending to births, we might have healthier outbirthing outcomes in this country. And we know of a long history of the medical profession's interference with their ability to exist as professionals. We know of a history of Black midwives and doulas
participation and struggles for reproductive freedom and health, better health for Black people. So there are ways that we can criticize the birthing practices of the mainstream medical institutions. I showed you the statistic. The U.S. has a horrible conditions of birth right now. There's nothing that the healthcare system in the U.S. can boast about when it comes to birth. We have an increasing rate of maternal mortality. And so there's a basis for questioning it and a basis for supporting an alternative of a feminist, Black women-led midwifery and doula practice that has been unjustly interfered with and burdened in the United States.
So, we're behind.
Yes.
Understatement. So, how many more questions did folks have? Okay, we see 3 hands, so we're going to do a cluster of questions, have the panel address it, and then we'll wrap up so you have enough time to enjoy the reception. And we have books for sale in the back by Book Culture, and Dr. Roberts will be signing them for a bit. So we'll just do this last circle. So there were 3 hands, one back here, one up here, one here. So.
Hi, so my name is Daniela. In your presentation, I found it really interesting how you talk about like prison system and stuff. And automatically what I started to think about was like a different prison system, the immigration detention centers. I actually wanted to ask you how you feel, or how the panel feels about how killing the Black body, like how that can, how I don't know how to describe it, but what the impact of the book or the rhetoric in the book, how that could affect immigration or immigration policy, or how you see that.
Hi, my name's Key. I am interested in figuring out how we can approach this issue on the reproductive rights of women of color. What steps can we take specifically, acknowledging that this isn't on the political agenda, I would say, for Black politics specifically, but the government at large?
Hi, my name is Yiran Liu, and my background is also similarly in biomedical research and also sociology, and my foreseeable future is in biomedical research, but I'm passionate about reconciling science and social justice in the current age, and so I was hoping to ask about some of Professor Roberts' work in fatal invention, and I know that Professor Nelson has also done research on genetic ancestry testing and the new modern technologies. So I was wondering, in this current political climate, and whatever future political climate happens, is there any way to do science or research or technology in a way that drives social progress and social change? And how can you prevent your discoveries from being used for wrong purposes? Because one example that I might think of is studying how the effects of racism affect health and lead to persistent health disparities, but then that might again become another way in which race is written into your epigenome, for example. So how do we prevent our science from being used in this way?
Great question. So if I might, I can say a little bit about this question and the last question. But Dorothy was too humble to say about killing the Black body. I mean, she said, I wasn't really writing about prisons, but you were. And the book really was prescient and writing about the tip of the iceberg of what became, decades later, a completely, a rabid system of mass incarceration. And it is the Black women, Black women as the miner's canary, right? I mean, that's we can think about killing the Black body as a kind of early instantiation that you were able to sort of highlight. So I would just offer, to the extent that immigration detention centers are part of this whole carceral system, that Dorothy's book is a way to sort of help understand that, and particularly in her, courage again and again to sort of call out the sort of the dehumanization that lays at the very basis of it, that sort of operates through and on the bodies of Black women, but is a tragedy that awaits us all, and not just the women that she writes about in her book as it went on and on. And to your question, I would just say, I think it's difficult to reconcile science and social justice. I mean, they weren't meant to go together, right? And so it takes a kind of like acrobatics to try to do it. I guess from my scholarly generation as a student of Troy Duster's and Andrew Ross's and others, I mean, I think what I feel like we must say in this moment, as science and technology and medicine has literally become pervasive, the infrastructure of everything we do, like literally, there's never been a moment in history like this, that our posture can't only be critical and can't only be kind of negation and rejection. And so so I think that you can never win. Like, I don't think that you can ever win a social justice politics regime and science. Like, I think that there's too much built in and baked into science to make that possible. But I also think giving our alternatives, that one of the alternatives has to be to engage the science critically, to critique the science, and in some cases when it's possible, to take up the science, to engage it in in struggles for social change.
Yeah, and of course, Alonda's books, Body and Soul and Social Life of DNA, are examples of that. They are examples of how, despite the way that science is so embedded with racism and has been so involved in producing race for the service of racism and white supremacy, there have always been ways that Black people and other people of color and other people challenging science to struggle for a more just and humane world have engaged with it. There are always examples of, Du Bois, for example, engaging with eugenicists, not always in the most, sometimes in problematic ways, but nevertheless, looking at the ways in which the society, the unjust society, produced the effects that scientists of the day were attributing to innate racial inferiority. It's a struggle. It's a difficult struggle, but there are examples of how to do that. Let me just say, Alonda, I thought you really captured a lot in what you said. Just to add a little bit to the immigration question, I do see Killing the Black Body as being relevant to the violations that go on in immigration detention, and also in the way in which undocumented immigrants, really immigrants in general, especially immigrants of color, are portrayed as the problem in America, producing the problems in America, very similar to the ways that Black women's wombs are seen as producing inequality and social problems. And one way of focusing on this is the case of the young woman who was seeking an abortion, and the way in which the Trump administration tried to prevent her from getting an abortion at the same time that Trump is spouting these claims that immigrants are, especially Latinx immigrants, are causing social problems and supporting policies that would deny women immigrant women, prenatal care, and health care for their children explicitly on grounds that these women are coming to the United States to have babies in order so they would be U.S. citizens. So you've got these conflicting, seemingly conflicting policies, but what are they about? They're all about controlling these women, blaming them for social problems in the United States to deflect attention away from the very racist structures that the Trump administration is supporting. And it works very much the same way as I described in Killing the Black Body, these policies about Black women and our toxic wombs that are the cause of poverty and other forms of inequality. So I think it operates in a very similar way. And then the steps, someone asked about steps, going back to the discussion, what you were saying, Lauren, and I think Anthony, you were saying as well, the importance of linking what we do in the academy with the work of people outside the academy who are organizing to make the changes that we're writing about. I think that there are multiple ways that you can organize. I know that I could not have written Killing the Black Body without connecting with a burgeoning, just emerging reproductive justice movement. I wouldn't have had the insights, I wouldn't have had the information, and I wouldn't have had the inspiration to do it without working with reproductive justice activists. And it's beautiful the way in which people on the panel have talked about how it contributed to their intellectual development. Also beautiful, inspiring for me is when I hear activists say how Killing the Black Body assisted in some small way in their activism. And so find a way to organize. There are lots of organizations, groups that are advocating for reproductive justice more and more. And so that's one step to take.
So I know we're going to have to wrap up, Michelle. Selina, did you want to say anything? Okay. All right. Just want to make sure.
Yeah. So as we conclude this part of the conversation, I just ask you to join us once again in thanking Dr. Roberts for coming.